Noah's flood. How powerful are we talking?
Catastrophic. There's no better word. Catastrophic. The earth was torn apart. Landscapes were torn apart. Mountains brought down. Valleys flattened out. But everything was transformed. I think we struggle at times to come to grips with this because we can't comprehend the absolute sheer violence and the catastrophe that occurred at that time. It's beyond our comprehension.
Were there tsunamis?
Oh, absolutely. That would have been in the order of 30 or 50 metres easily.
Creationists believe that there was a little boat floating around. Would it really have survived? Ron Neller, you're a flood expert and you're here today to talk about the catastrophic event of Noah's flood. What credentials do you hold to speak on this topic?
Good question, Matt. I've travelled the world studying landforms and floods. I prefer the term flood chaser, if you like. Lots of experience in different continents, different climatic zones, and so on. Did that as a teacher and a researcher with universities for 35 years.
So, Ron, is there any actual evidence that there was a global flood?
Oh, absolutely. No matter whether you're looking at it from a land point of view, from a biological point of view, the evidence is overwhelming across scientific disciplines that there was a global flood.
So, with this global flood, is there any evidence of a pre-flood world, any other structures that are underneath?
No, Matt. There are no previous structures that one would expect. You would expect if there had been a flood and sediment had been deposited, like all sediment today, it would be placed on an existing landform or landscape. But no matter whether we drill deep into the earth, no matter whether we use seismics and so on, which penetrate the earth as well, and I've used both, we actually find no evidence of a previous landscape. So what did happen in the past was catastrophic on a global scale.
Is it concerning that you don't find that evidence?
I think it's very much connecting the evidence with the biblical interpretation that we have that God did create a global flood. And it did, as we see in 2 Peter 3:6, for example, in the New Testament even, that the previous earth and the landscapes were totally removed.
So you're saying that the world today looks nothing like it looked pre-flood?
Well, absolutely not. Whether you look outside now and you see mountains or rivers or valleys or coastlines, that's not the way it was prior to a global flood.
So then we don't know where Noah really left.
No, we don't, actually, because the Earth's surface doesn't look like anything like it did today. It doesn't resemble anything as it used to be. In fact, I had a fascinating journey once with a lovely Christian pastor, an Aboriginal in Northern Territory, who took me up into the Arnhem Land, beautiful sedimentary structures in Northern Territory in Australia,
Beautiful.
and humorously said to me, "I think this is where Noah could have launched the ark." And we had a lot of fun sharing that journey. We even started to imagine, suppose Noah had an Australian accent when he boarded that boat. And so you can imagine an Australian accent with Noah. "Come on, you larrikins, get on the tinny, bring the women with you."
Okay, so the ark could have come from anywhere and the land looks much different today than it ever did. But what do we find instead of the old landscape?
We find a very deep sedimentary landscape today all around the world. We have what are called megasequences, massive sequences of sediment, kilometres deep all around the planet. That's what we find instead. And then on top of that is a carving of landscapes from a post-flood. But we can talk about that later. But today, this planet is a sedimentary planet with these massive megasequences, we call them that, of sediment, kilometres deep.
So is it surprising that we're a sedimentary planet?
It is somewhat surprising because we have explored some of the planets nearby in Mars and so on. They're not sedimentary planets. Yes, there's a little bit of dust blowing around and things like this, but we are an incredibly different planet. We clearly indicate water erosion and sedimentation has occurred on this planet on a scale massive. You cannot compare it to another planet.
So Ron, can you tell me a little bit more about these megasequences and what their explanations could be?
Yeah, a megasequence, as I said, is an incredible layer of sediment. It's often in a certain structure. You'll often find at the base, you'll find the coarser material, some sandstones. You'll often find some finer materials such as shales, and on top you might find some limestones as well. And so the argument is that there has been sorting going on during this megasequence deposition of sediment.
Okay, so you as a creationist, and I presume it's common among creationists, believe that these sedimentary layers were caused by the flood. But how would a secular scientist view these sedimentary layers or these mega sequences?
Yeah, good question, Matt. The classic interpretation is that these would have been deposited during the Ice Age, non-Ice Age period. So they argue that multiple ice ages have occurred in the past, and that each of these ice ages and non-ice age periods allowed for the deposition of a massive sequence of sediments. That's why they argue that the classic model is sandstone, shale, and limestone. But when you travel the world, that's not quite what you find. You find in some sequences, you'll actually find the limestone on the bottom, and then shale and the sandstone on the top. Or you'll find shale on the bottom and salt on the bottom, or salt as well. So the sequence is not uniform around the globe, and it suggests I'm very uncomfortable with an argument based on a repetitive Ice Age and non-Ice Age period meant to lay down a sequence that's similar to the previous one and so on, yet that's not what we see. We see differences in those sequences. That indicates to me that it's more of a flood deposit.
Thanks for watching the interview so far. Just a quick one. If you haven't already, make sure you click that subscribe button so you can see more of this content. Back to the interview.
You mentioned there's inconsistencies. What would have caused these inconsistencies within the different layers?
Well, it's very similar to a very large flood today.
Yeah.
You don't find the flood waters flowing smoothly and gently. You'll find variations within a flood plain or a large coastal area under flooding. There'll be areas of turbulence. There'll be areas of more placid conditions, more calm conditions. And so you'll get different deposits of sediments in different locations, even in the one flood. So when we look at those megasequences and the differences we see around the world, they're no different in their sorting variation as a modern flood does today, particularly even a very, very large flood would do the same deposition. And so my point being there is that, again, it reflects a singular flood. You'll find those variations within a singular flood.
So if it was a global flood, is there any evidence that indicates that it was a rapid process like floods are today, and not that it was more like the ice ages that were quite a slow process creating these different sedimentary layers?
There's very strong evidence, and one line of evidence I can share with you is what's called bioturbation. Okay. Bioturbation is simply, it's the reworking of sediment by organic organisms, so, crustaceans and worms and so on. You'll see that whenever sediment is deposited, very quickly it begins to be occupied with creatures or weeds or grasses or something like that, and you see a disruption going on in that sediment. So if sediments had been deposited over millions of years, as the argument goes on, and there might be millions of years between one layer and another, then I would expect in that period of time that you would see evidence of the disruption of the surface, either through biological activity or bioturbation, or even some erosional activities, another rainfall or so. Now, we know bioturbation, by the way, does begin to operate within hours.
Within hours?
Within hours. And therefore, within days, you have a complete disruption to your sedimentary layer. And yet what we find when we look closely at these mega sequences of sediment, we don't find this disruption going on. We find beautiful, sharp boundaries that will go for hundreds, if not thousands of kilometres, and no evidence of biological activity. And so clearly that indicates that each layer was not put down over a sequence of time slowly, it was put down rapidly when even biological responses could not occur. In other words, those layers were put down not over years, they were put down rapidly within days of each other.
So just as a summary, you're saying that the global flood has been indicated by the rapid development of the sedimentary layers, causing these mega sequences that have no, what was the word? Bioturbation. So no mixing of the layers. They're very sharp, you said. They're very clear. So in a flood, or the Great Flood, Noah's Flood, what first happened?
How did the flood start?
Yeah.
Oh, dramatic. And the Bible makes that quite clear. There was a splitting of the earth, and the deep waters came out with force from deep in the earth and began the flooding process. In fact, we suspect these days, given our Earth's exploration and so on, that the waters certainly did come from deep down and so on. And so the first step would have been the bursting of the surface, water pouring out. But there was also volcanic activity. We know that because some of the sedimentary layers have volcanic activity as well. So you would have seen an eruption of waters. You would have also then seen, because I'm sure you would ask the question, what about the rainfall, that the actual rainfall would occur at the same time. Because whenever there's volcanic activity, you place dust particles in the atmosphere and that causes rainfall. So if you look at Mount St. Helens or if you look at Krakatoa, whenever there's been volcanic activity, it creates a lot of dust, which then causes the water vapor to precipitate, and you had heavy rainfall as well. So the Bible makes it quite clear. It burst forth from the ground, and there was also rainfall at the same time. So that's how the flood commenced.
So water just started babbling out of the earth. The gates of heaven were opened up and it just started raining down. Some volcanoes happened. Were there anything else that was going on? Were there tsunamis?
Oh, absolutely. Turbulence and chaos, worldwide, global. There would have been, if it's hard for us to imagine this because we have not experienced a planet with simply water on it. But the sheer velocities of flow, the turbulence in that flow, the tsunamis possible, absolutely. So we can detect, or we can't see it. We weren't there. But we can sort of model it from a computer point of view, or we can also look at it from the sedimentary point of view because the sediments indicate to us the type of conditions.
Okay. And creationists believe that there was a little boat floating around. Would it really have survived?
Of that, there's no doubt. I mean, I think we also need to be blunt that God explained to Noah how to build that boat. So he didn't build one that was shaky. He was giving him the dimensions. Now, those dimensions, by the way, represent the dimensions of the most stable vessel that can be created today. Tested in naval laboratories or flume studies and so on. That vessel, the Ark, was built for stability. It wasn't built to travel anywhere. It was built to survive. And so it is an incredibly weighted towards the bottom. Its width and its length give it incredible stability beyond our best boats today, which have bows and sterns and so on. They wouldn't survive those tsunami waves and so on that would have been, by the way, in the order of 30 or 50 metres easily in height. The Ark has been tested under those simulated conditions and has no problem whatsoever of travelling in those conditions.
So you're saying the Ark could have survived all of the wind and all of the waves, but what about the tsunamis themselves?
Interesting, when we think of a tsunami, we think of it from a Hollywood point of view. We see a massive wave breaking, smashing cities and so on.
Yeah.
Tsunamis aren't like that. They're energy waves. Now, when they do form an actual wave, they don't break, particularly when they're in the ocean. That's why boats go out to sea when a tsunami is coming, because there is no breaking wave. So the Ark didn't have to deal with a ginormous breaking wave. What it had to deal with was just very large fluctuations in height with long wavelengths. And so, again, it could just ride over those without turbulence. It's wouldn't have been a challenge to ride a tsunami.
Wow, that's incredible.
Hope you're enjoying the interview so far. We'll jump back in shortly. But real quick, imagine bringing this life-changing message to your church or community. This is exactly what we do. We present at close to 1,000 events each year. So many people struggle with how science and the Bible fit together, and it becomes a genuine stumbling block to their faith. But our speakers present satisfying answers that really make sense. We've received hundreds, possibly thousands of testimonies from people who have had their lives changed through our speaking ministry. If you'd like that for your congregation or community, then use the link in the description and contact us today.
Can you explain a little bit more about what happened after the flood started to recede?
Good question, Matt. And we have covered this in other YouTubes that Taz Walker has done and myself, Ron Neller, have done as well. But essentially at that stage, as the floods are receding, the flood doesn't flow off the land gently. It never happens like that. When massive floodwaters flow off land, what they do is they concentrate and then they begin to have specific impacts on the emerging land. So it'll create canyons and gorges, it'll create plateaus and all these sorts of things. And so what we see then is the landscape that we have today isn't created by processes today. You're actually looking at a historical landscape created about 4,500 years ago.
Yeah, wow. So what are some of the examples of these canyons that you've suggested?
Well, you could look at the Grand Canyon. You could look at, in Australia, you could look at Katoomba. The fascinating thing about these canyons is we know that they are not created by today's processes. We have measured those processes now for up to 100 years in some cases, and they are not creating, deepening, lengthening the canyons of any significance to explain them. In fact, rather interesting little comment I have here is that even Charles Darwin stood on the edge of the Katoomba Canyon, which is a broad canyon, very broad, very large canyon, and said no river could have ever carved this. So even in that era, we knew the rivers could not have done it. And today we confirm that. They are historic. They are remnants of the waters flowing off an emerging landscape.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, before we close, did you have any other final comments about the power or the severity of the flood?
The power and the severity of the flood are often asked of me when I'm in churches, speaking in churches or youth groups and so on. I think we have a great deal of difficulty understanding that. Firstly, we've never experienced it. We don't experience. We see local floods and regional floods. We don't see global floods. So there's a problem there of connecting that really did happen. And I find that to some extent personally disappointing because it's not just the evidence of a landscape. It's not just the evidence of the biological activity as well. We also have cultural evidence. We have, for example, cultures all around the world speak of a flood of global, whether you're in China where I lived for 10 years or elsewhere. Hundreds of cultures around the world speak of a single global flood and basically have an ark and basically have about 8 people and a lot of creatures on that ark. So we have all this evidence as well. I think we struggle at times to come to grips with this because we can't comprehend the absolute sheer violence and the catastrophe that occurred at that time. It's beyond our comprehension.
That's interesting. Is there any scriptural evidence?
It's abundant, Matt. Abundant. When you look at the amount of time in the book of Genesis allocated to the flood, that is a very significant event in the book of Genesis. It's an event that Jesus himself refers to. He doesn't deny. In fact, he actually links the flood to his own return as well. So he's not just talking at it as a historic point of view. He's also looking at it from a prophetic point of view, looking ahead at his return and likening that to the flood event as well. So it's very powerful in Scripture. It's referred to not just by Jesus, but by other apostles and writers of the New Testament as well. And it was very important to me personally, because having studied for 35 years as a researcher and a non-Christian, but having heard of the journey of the flood, the story of the flood in the Bible by people I connected with, the evidence that I had from a geologic point of view and from a cultural point of view, because I had lived overseas for many years and heard these stories from so many different cultures and saw the geological evidence, the fact that I actually read it in the Bible in abundance in the Old Testament and the New Testament actually brought me to Christ. Scripturally, this is a very powerful piece of scripture on referring to the flood.
Now, Ron, we also have a resource here, the Answers book. Can you give us a overview of that?
Well, this book here, which I'll just hold up, that book there is the Answers book, but we have it as an e-book as well. Yeah. I think the powerful thing about that particular book and all the e-book is it doesn't just talk about what we're talking about today, which is the flood itself and its dynamics. Yeah. It actually deals with things like the Ice Age and what happened after the flood. It actually deals with the landscapes that we briefly discussed and how they came to be. Well, this book has much more depth on all of that, then connects it in to elements of biological activity and evolutionary activity and so on. That's an incredible book that personally we've used it ourselves in our own home groups and studies, maybe taking a lesson at a particular evening, and it just draws so much attention when you get to look at it a little bit deeper. So that ebook, I recommend it strongly. And by the way, the ebook is a free ebook.
Fantastic. Well, I'll make sure that there's a link in the description below. Thanks so much for the conversation, Ron.
Thank you, Matt.